The world's on fire. Our river's gone dry. The rich are getting richer. They've left us out here to die. Mass migration. We got no place to hide. Who's against us? Who's on our side? Are they too dumb or are they just in on it? Liars and cheaters, a red-hot grip. Ditch the gaslighting gas bag that speaks in code. He's a faker, a shaker, a pontificating pantload. In this house of mirrors, we've hit the wall before it's too late. Let's go. Come on, y'all. It's border to border and coast to coast. It's real, it's facts, and it ain't no hoax. It's Podcast by George, and it's showtime, folks. Oh, hi, how are you? Welcome on in to another Podcast by George. Folks that follow my show know that that's the drama intro, and these are dramatic times, folks. It's bad. It's getting worse, and if we don't do something, if we don't wake up, if we don't face the truth as to what's happening in this country and around the world, it's going to be irretrievable. We're not going to be able to recover. Think about the big three on the PBG: climate, war, and healthcare. That's what I'm talking about. They all result in death. If you're dead, you can't get it back, folks. I mean, ain't nobody been able to do it yet that I know of. And I hope you saw the thumbnail for the show today. And it's this: long live the truth. The late, great Daniel Ellsberg and then Julian Assange. We're going to be talking about that stuff with this guy. It is Brad Wolf. He's coming back on the Podcast by George live line. Now, Brad's the executive director and founder of the Peace Action Network, Lancaster, PA. He's a former prosecutor, a lawyer, and a community college dean, and he heads the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. We've had him on the show before to talk about all of that, and we're going to talk about it again today. But if I don't get him up on the stream, we won't be able to do it. There he is. Hey. Let's say good morning to our friend, Brad Wolf. Hi, Brad.
Hi, how are you? Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm still thinking a lot about the late, great Daniel Ellsberg. He had a lot to do with my decision to become a journalist back in the early 70s when I entered college and took journalism as a focus, as for my degree. As my major, people were talking about Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. I mean, that's what it was all about. Actually, people at that juncture were still talking about McCarthy, but I mean, that was the big influence. That and Watergate, of course, with Robert Woodward, who's since gone missing. But Daniel Ellsberg never did. He fought the good fight right to the very end. And I want to bring this up on screen because this is beautiful. Now, this is from the great Caitlin Johnstone. I've talked about her on the show before. Encourage everybody to search Caitlin Johnstone. Go to her Substack and subscribe to what she has to say. She's Australian. She's a third party looking in at this mess. As I say on my show, if you've got something wrong with you, you may not want to be the person looking in the mirror. You may not see it, but she sees it, and she wrote this great eulogy for Daniel Ellsberg. I want to read through this. It won't take very long. She says, "Thank you for your service. I say this is not the employees of the war machine, who in truth serve nothing besides imperial domination and the profit margins of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin." Of course, that's Brad's nemesis and the tribunals also. She says, "I say this to the peacemakers, to the truth tellers, to the defiant ones, to those who've shown the light of truth upon the blood-spattered face of the empire against their own interest for the benefit of everyone, to those who've stared down the barrel of the most powerful military force ever assembled and said, 'Do your worst.'" She's talking about Ellsberg, folks. "To the selfless martyrs who've exposed the abuses of the machine, knowing full well that the scales of justice are weighted heavily against them. To the hero in Belmarsh," you know who she's talking about, Julian Assange. "To the Pentagon Papers whistleblower who today closed his gentle, loving eyes for a final time. Thank you for your service." You know, we hear that all the time and I've got my own issues with that. Thank you for your service. This is what and it's for Ellsberg, folks, for serving the highest interest over your own, for pouring everything you've got into the hope for a better tomorrow, for betting everything on the hope of a healthy and harmonious world, for creating a guiding light to help humanity steer its way home, for seizing your moment to help make things right instead of letting it pass like everyone around you, for somehow finding the strength to swim against the current when it would be much easier to drift along with the madness, for somehow finding a higher calling in this wildly dysfunctional society where everything is pointed at selfishness and meaningless, for somehow cultivating something profound and authentic within yourself in the midst of a civilization of the vapid and the fraudulent. Thank you for your service. We will do our best to carry the torch forward and finish what you started. And I'm just amazed. I mean, she's this great writer, poet, obviously, and then a painter. This is an oil that she did. And I don't know. I mean, I thought that was, there's a lot of eulogies out there for Ellsberg, but I thought that was one of the best, Brad. And the way that I put it with Ellsberg is, if you save somebody's life, that's something that you could be touted, and rightfully so, for the rest of your life. Ellsberg, you could make an argument he saved thousands, tens of thousands of lives by putting himself at risk with those Pentagon Papers. Who the hell else can say that? I don't think people look at it in that context, often enough, Brad.
Yeah, that's a beautiful tribute. What a eulogy,
Yes.
and what a life. He, 93, I guess, when he passed. And I wrote down just in the last message he put out, he said, "My life is filled with joy and gratitude." And how many people really get to say that at the end of their life? He had dedicated it to peace, to disarmament, to trying to stop nuclear proliferation, and a tremendous cost to himself. He did stare down the barrel of the military and the full power of the US government, fully expected to spend the rest of his life in prison, and yet went ahead and did it. And my friend John Deere wrote another eulogy in the National Catholic Reporter this last weekend about him, and said that Dan was the real thing in a time of no leadership, no vision. Dan was the real thing. He was prophetic, he was courageous, he was bold, and he walked the walk. And truth tellers like that, those are the American heroes that we need to revere, that we need to teach young people in schools. They're not spreading falsehoods, they're telling the truth. And it says a lot about how free our country really is if we put truth tellers behind bars. So, kudos to him.
Yeah, and, like you say, he walked the walk. I didn't realize, I just read recently, he was arrested 85 times, and most importantly, he was facing arrest and knew it and fully expected to be arrested on espionage charges, like they're holding, Julian Assange on, trying to get him extradited to the United States. I mean, he was facing life imprisonment, and he knew it, and he did this, but he did it to save thousands of U.S. lives. And, on the other side of the equation, the Vietnamese, with the losses that they were taking, there could be 100,000 people alive over there because of that guy. I just think that's absolutely phenomenal. And I mentioned Julian Assange. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, 2 years ago, he also released that information from 1957 about the Pentagon's plan to use nuclear weapons against China over the island of Quemoy. And he purposely did that wanting to go to prison because he wanted to challenge the constitutionality of the Espionage Act. So he was willing to go to prison and try to take on the constitutionality of the Espionage Act. Again, incredibly brave, a man well into his 80s doing that kind of thing.
Well, and here just in the past year or two, I don't remember the particulars exactly, but he basically claimed and contacted the authorities and said, "I had access to the same information I distributed, I did the same thing Assange did. Come get me."
Right.
I mean, yeah. And I mean, the courage of this guy, honest to God. Well, we got to get to some other things here. And I wanted to start off with that, but I also wanted to segue into the situation with Julian Assange and a guy that this is my go-to guy. Got to be. I mean, it's Chris Hedges, folks. And he's writing, I mean, he is dumbfounded. He is horror struck by the situation with Assange. It looks like his options have about run out. Now, Brad would know more about that legal stuff than I would, but it looks to me like Assange is going to be extradited. Somebody's going to put a hood over his head, take him out on a tarmac, and throw him on a cargo plane for the United States, maybe this week. And here's what Chris Hedges says, Brad. He says the imminent extradition of Julian Assange and the death of journalism. And Chris Hedges is not a doomer, folks. He's not a hyperbole guy. I mean, think about what he's saying. Chris Hedges won a Pulitzer Prize and an Emmy. And think of what he's saying here. Julian Assange's legal options have nearly run out. He could be extradited to the United States this week. Yeah, should he be convicted in the U.S., any reporting on the inner workings of power will become a crime. He writes, the extradition of Julian will be the next step in the slow motion execution of the publisher and founder of WikiLeaks and one of the most important journalists of our generation. Some would say the most important. It will ensure that Julian spends the rest of his life in a U.S. prison. It will create legal precedents that will criminalize any investigation into the inner workings of power, even by citizens from another country, which he is. It will be a body blow to our anemic democracy, which is rapidly metamorphosing into corporate totalitarianism. He says, I am as stunned by this full frontal assault. Yeah, they're not stabbing us in the back, folks. They're stabbing us in the front on journalism, as I am by the lack of public outrage, especially by the media. The very belated call from the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and El País, all of whom published material provided by WikiLeaks to drop the extradition charges is too little, too late. All of the public protests I have attended in defense of Julian in the United States are sparsely attended. Now, they're well attended in other places, including London. Our passivity makes us complicit in our own enslavement. And I'll wrap this up with this now. He says the CIA and intelligence agencies, along with the military, all of which operate without effective congressional oversight, are the engines behind Julian's extradition. Julian inflicted, by exposing their crimes and lies, a grievous wound. They demand vengeance. They control these forces. Seek abroad is the control they seek at home. So it says the control these forces seek abroad is the control they seek at home. Now, Julian may soon be in prison for life in the U.S. for journalism, but he won't be the only one. And now this goes to this legal part of this, and you understand this, Brad, the precedent part of this. Explain how that works.
Yeah, when you read the Espionage Act itself, the way it was passed under Woodrow Wilson, it says that if you release information that harms the United States and is to the benefit of another country, a foreign country, then you can be charged under the Espionage Act. And so it's difficult to try to fathom how a foreign citizen like Assange, an Australian, who didn't take the material, he received the classified material and published it, how you can argue that he did that with the intent to harm the United States and benefit another country, because in fact, the material was true. I think he could argue that I was trying to help the United States to face up to where it's committed some wrongs and to try to improve that so it's not violating international law. So this is a really dangerous precedent where they're trying to suppress any kind of truth telling. The government, the US government, currently classifies about 50 million documents a year. So when you're classifying pretty much everything the government does, you ask the question, how free is this country that we live in when everything the government does is classified and cannot be released to us and we cannot see it? So doing this to Assange, trying to send him to prison for life, is going to have a very chilling effect, or at least its intention is to have a chilling effect. Whether it will, I don't know. It may embolden a lot of people to try to challenge it even more. And that would be my hope, that a lot of journalists would seek to challenge this, because he's a great journalist. He's done America a great favor, just like Daniel Ellsberg did. And, it's going to be interesting to see the way this plays out. The UK judge waived the extradition arguments and looks like they're going to send him here to stand trial. So it could be a great rallying point for journalism and a great test for journalism. The New York Times, the Post, every major newspaper in America should be coming to his aid at this point.
Yeah, and they've written kind of tepid, very late arriving support letters for Julian Assange. It's clearly not enough. Now, I'm not, understanding of legal precedent, legal issues very much, but I do understand historical precedent. And Ellsberg is a perfect example of when it comes to Assange. People would have said during Ellsberg's time with the release of those Pentagon Papers, my God, that man has put the country at risk. Our operatives are going to be killed all over Asia, all over the country. What great harm he's done by releasing these. Guess what? Guess it saved thousands, tens of thousands of lives. No harm was done. You look at Assange, the same type of thing. They say, well, this guy can't be running around publishing this leaked material from Chelsea Manning and people like that. This puts our operatives in danger, our country. No, it doesn't. What it does is it opens our eyes and should make people aware of the horror of war, because what he's being charged with, shockingly, is revealing that videotape of that Apache helicopter strike in Baghdad that resulted in the deaths of civilians and journalists. Reuters, journalists, and Reuters is, they're not running to the forefront on this issue. Neither are these major mainstream media outlets. My God, this is one of our own, a
Right.
journalist charged for releasing this crime, war crime against journalists. I mean, it really is what I call on my show, Brad, a house of mirrors.
It is. And when you talk about harm to the country under the act, you
Yeah.
have to make the distinction between political harm and true national harm. And, yeah, there may be a political harm done by releasing this information, but that's not what the Espionage Act is meant to cover legally. It's meant to cover actually national harm to U.S. assets. And, as you said, the video that he released showed U.S. military shooting these people with the Apache helicopter gunship, and their innocence. There's some jokes being made as they're sort of shooting all of these people. This is something the American people need to see, because this is war. This is real. This is what happens when we just blindly vote for people and let $1 trillion a year go to our defense budget. So we need to be made aware of the brutality of what happens in war. And this isn't just U.S. soldiers who do this. Any soldier in a war engages in this kind of behavior. And that's why we need journalists to expose it, to reveal it to us. I think some of the mainstream media that didn't come to his attention right away were a little miffed because they were scooped by Assange on this. And he put the information out before they got a chance to.
Yeah, and to underscore what you're saying there about these, what war is like, that was Matthew Ho's first reaction. He's regular on my show. He was interviewed because he was the guy that left the State Department because he saw what was going on with the United States in Afghanistan and said, "I don't want any part of this. They're lying to us." Um, his reaction was very simple. He looked at that and then looked at the reaction of people seeing that video and said, "My God, what do you think we were doing over there?"
Right.
I mean, that's what this is.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah, that's
It
what
really
happens.
is. Yep.
Yeah.
That's the brutality of war. It brings out the worst in human nature, the most base instincts in human nature. And we should try to be creating an atmosphere where we're bringing out the best in human nature. We bring out, the courage, the humanity, the beauty that all of us have, rather than this kind of violence and just the cavalier attitude, the contempt for humanity that's displayed in war. I think it goes against the grain of what we're meant to do. And there's been a lot of books written about military moral injury and how the human brain is really not wired to accept this, no matter what the military does to try to get troops to accept the violence that they do. When they come home, they suffer, and they can't sort of straighten that circle. They can't square that circle. It's just the fact that that's not something we're meant to do. So American people have to recognize this. We watch too many movies and think it's all clean, Top Gun kind of thing and heroic. It's not. It's horrible. It's ugly. It's women and children, the sick that are bearing the cost, innocents getting killed. And our tax dollars go to that. And our country does that in our name. And a recent poll of the military, the military is always conducting polls around the world to check out how they're viewed. And I think over the last poll they did, over 72% of the world claim that the U.S. is their biggest fear and number one enemy. So, we're not this bastion of freedom, and democracy in the eyes of the rest of the world. They're terrified of us, and rightfully so.
Yeah, and I don't want to exactly what Brad's talking about here. I talked about Chris Hedges. This is his most recent, the greatest evil is war, and he's got a chapter in here that makes Saving Private Ryan, the first 15 minutes of that, seem like what it is, a Hollywood movie, because
Yeah.
he's been to the theater of war. He knows what it's like, and he writes about it in here, and it is it's like nothing I mean, you don't even think about it. I mean, we watched Hollywood, and it's these flesh wounds and people that are, that die, no.
Right.
I mean, faces blown off, people. It's just horrific. So there's that book, and then I got this book. I'm gonna have this guy on. This is Kevin Gostola. He's coming on my show next week. This is the Guilty of Journalism book that he just wrote about Julian Assange. If you have any questions about Assange, read this, or at the very least, watch the show with Kevin, because he's absolutely great. And if anybody has questions about Assange, bring them up now while Brad and I are on here, because I would be happy to impart what little knowledge I have. But one thing I did see recently, I had a show on, and somebody said, well, Assange should go back to Sweden and stand charges on those rape charges. Well, those were thrown out of court. The amnesia was by the supposed victims set in. They couldn't recall or recollect any of that stuff. And of course, it's smear 101. It's what they do when they find these sexual things to smear someone with, to degrade them in the mind, the body politic, basically. And that's all that Sweden thing was. The one of the leading women's anti-rape organizations even came out in charge of Assange. They weren't buying that stuff. So I kind of wanted to mention that, because somebody had brought that up on my show.
It's the same thing they did to Ellsberg. If you remember, when he released it, they tried to smear him because he was going to a counselor, a psychologist, and so they were trying to say that he suffered from mental health issues and therefore couldn't be trusted.
God,
so
you got to see through this stuff. Yeah. All right, so we're gonna move along here. I want to get to Brad's wheelhouse here, which is the Emergence of Death War Crimes Tribunal, and his observations regarding these major news stories, and they're all bad. Like I said, this Assange thing, you can't understate the significance of it. Probably going to happen this week, a lot of observers say. So stay tuned, but let's stay tuned to this stuff as well. Putin says Russia put nuclear bombs in Belarus as warning to the West. All right, now, Brad, I've had to. Every word means something. We've talked about Putin on my show before. Is he a war criminal for executing the war in Ukraine? Yeah. Is he every negative you want to say about him? Is he former KGB? That might be the most negative thing you could say about the guy. Yes. One positive thing, I don't know if it's positive, but one accurate thing you can say about the guy is he seems in a lot of instances to walk it like he talks it. And he's putting these bombs, nukes in Belarus. We ought to be paying attention to that, Brad.
Yeah, we should be. And nothing I say excuses Putin's war in Ukraine, the barbarism of it and the horrific toll that it's taken. So I just want to say that up front to put things in context. But it is clear the U.S. played a major role in provoking it. This war could have been avoided. And those nukes going into Belarus is what happens when you're not paying attention to superpower interest. After the Cold War, the United States, instead of still being sensitive to the fact that Russia had aspirations to be a superpower, or at least a player in the game, the U.S. instead wanted to be the sole power. And so instead of disbanding NATO, which was a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union, they decided to go in search of a new mission for NATO. And you start pulling all these Warsaw Pact countries into NATO, and you aggravate and irritate and poke the bear. You kind of ratchet up this war fever. Now, after many, many warnings by Putin over the years not to militarize Ukraine, not to include it in NATO, we've gone down that road, and he's placing bombs in Belarus. And he cites as justification for that the nuclear bombs that we have in Turkey. So, yeah, we do. And Poland now wants NATO nuclear bombs on their soil. So, it's back to where we were, unfortunately, during the height of the Cold War, without any of the confidence building measures or any of the dialogue that kind of kept us somewhat in check during the Cold War.
Yeah. Remember what I said about precedent? People will say, this Putin, he's a warmongering, bloodthirsty maniac. Okay. This is the bear that you're going to poke. This
Right.
guy's currently at war in Ukraine. I mean, he may have lost already 100,000 of his most beloved sons in Ukraine. When this guy tells you something like that, I mean, the precedent has been set. It's right there. Let me bring this up on screen, this little part of this here. And I got to get it big enough at this size for me to look at. But again, this is Reuters. And this is just the summary that they put. Putin confirms Russia nuclear warheads in Belarus. Says more will be delivered by the end of the year. Every one of these things that's delivered is another opportunity for them to be used accidentally or on purpose, folks. Moscow sees no need to use nuclear weapons for now. Says screw the West on arms reduction talks. Well, yeah, because those have not borne any fruit previously. Both sides bear the responsibility for that, I would say. And then check this out. Of the three nuclear powers in NATO, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, only the United States is known to have provided weapons for nuclear sharing. As of November 2009, Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey, as Brad said, are hosting U.S. nuclear weapons as part of NATO's nuclear sharing policy. Now, Canada hosted weapons under the control of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, rather than NATO, until 1984, and Greece until 2001. The United Kingdom also received U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, such as nuclear artillery and lanced missiles, until 1992. Even though the UK is a nuclear weapon state in its own right, these were mainly deployed in Germany. So this underscores what we're talking about here. Yeah, these things are in place. Putin he's a maniac, but he's not a nut. He's looking at those weapons over there in those adjacent countries to Russia, and he's saying, okay, I'm going to stick them in Belarus, Brad.
Yeah, and we shouldn't be surprised at this. We really shouldn't. The way it's portrayed in the media is how dare he do such a thing, yet we're doing it in his backyard.
Yes.
And, the people in our government at the end of the Cold War basically had one job, right? Don't precipitate another war. Don't blow us up. That was what you get paid for. That's why you get to move back and forth between private industry and government and make the big bucks. Just don't provoke another war. And yet that's exactly the road they went down at the conclusion of the Cold War. And that's how we got to where we are right now. And, we have been the ones that pulled out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We pulled out of the INF Treaty. We pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty. This was all done during the 2000s so we could enhance our nuclear force, our nuclear posture. And right now, our nuclear posture is no longer one of deterrence, which is what it had been during the Cold War. It is one of preemptive strikes. Our missiles are far more accurate, far deadlier. And Putin, looking out, knows that our military posture for nukes is preemptive, not deterrent. Now, if you're looking out at that, you're going to respond to that eventually, especially if you have 6,000 nukes of your own, the way he does. So, he's responding to this constant change in U.S. policy over the last 30 years, and it shouldn't surprise us. I'm not justifying it in any way.
Right.
It just should not surprise us.
Yeah, understanding it does not justify it. A lot of people confuse those two things. Just because you can see through it, just because you can understand it, doesn't mean that you think that it's right. Obviously, Brad doesn't. Now, here's the part about the show that I talked about. Can you handle the truth? I mean, because the truth is looking bad and it's getting worse, and it looks like rapidly so. The reason I do the show, the reason that I want to help put a little voice out there in this, this patchwork quilt of left-wing independent media is because you're not seeing stories like Brad and I are talking about being reflected in the mainstream media. They're talking about Captain Butt Crunch, mostly Donald Trump. This is a big story. This isn't responsible statecraft, and you're not seeing it hardly anywhere. Will upcoming NATO summit launch forever war in Europe? What? Pressure is mounting to make some sort of formal declaration over Ukraine's membership at meetings in Vilnius next month. An article in the New York Times Wednesday, now this is just Wednesday of last week, claimed that pressure is building on Biden to announce a timetable for Ukrainian membership in NATO at its summit next month. God, Brad, I mean, Again,
Yeah.
this looks all bad to me, man. That looks like, and again, think about Putin over there with those nukes, this KGB guy, this guy that's currently conducting a war looking at this. What do you say about that?
Yeah, and you can look at him, and you can also look at, well, what would an American president do in his situation? And we kind of know. Certainly, JFK responded to the nukes in Cuba in a
Yeah.
very provocative way. Military blockade, naval blockade around the island, and all of that. But that idea of a forever war in Ukraine, it astounds me that the military is able to get away with forever wars again and again and again. We just got out of 20 years of forever wars. And you think that the American public, after all that expense, $6 trillion and all of those lives, and all that we're not able to do at home, you'd think that the American public would say, no more forever wars, we're done. And yet here we are heading down the road of a forever war in Ukraine, because Russia's not going to give up. And that this idea of dangling NATO membership in front of Ukraine is going to encourage Russia to stay in it more and more. And if Ukraine actually goes into NATO, they're going to fight even harder. So the one bargaining chip we have with Russia to end this war is to promise a neutral Ukraine, not NATO membership with them. And if we admit them, then we're taking the main bargaining chip we have for Russia to end the slaughter, and try to save us from some kind of nuclear confrontation. So, this is it's a crazy situation. Biden does seem a little resistant to giving that timetable to Ukraine. And I did read this morning that it doesn't look like they're going to give that actual commitment at this upcoming summit, that they've delayed it again. In that same article, I read that Poland wants Ukraine in NATO so bad that there is some concern that the Poles may intervene in the Ukrainian war so that they are attacked by Russia, thereby invoking Article 5 and having us have to respond, since Poland's a member. So it's the tail wagging the dog kind of situation.
Again, think of the precedent. Why is Ukraine at war right now? It's the encroachment of NATO. That's a big part of it. So what are we going to do? How are we going to fix it? Expand NATO, encroach more on, my God, what the hell are people thinking of? I want to ask you about something else, because the NATO situation and our non-compliance with what was promised, at the end of the Cold War, the fact that the Minsk Accords were never complied with, the fact that we supported that Maidan coup that overthrew Putin's buddy down there in Ukraine in 2014. All of those are contributing factors. But the other thing that Putin brings up all the time, and nobody seems to on this side seems to really pay attention. He talks about Nazis in Ukraine. I just saw where he gave a state of the finances thing in Russia, a major speech. And at the tail end of it, he talked a little bit about Ukraine, even though it was a financial forum of some type. And he said the most important thing, the number one thing, were Nazis in Ukraine. He wants them out of there. He wants them eradicated. He does not want Nazis on his border. And again, historically, you got to remember, I think as many as 15 million, the number is just unbelievable, Russians died in World War II at the hands of Nazis. But a lot of people think that claim's not credible about Nazis in Ukraine, including my friend Serhiy in Ukraine that's on my show. He doesn't seem to think that that's real. And I know people here would debate it, but I got a feeling it is real, Brad.
It is real. It's definitely real. Putin's concerned about it, and we should be concerned about it. We send $100 billion in military aid to an army that does have a problem with Nazis, with fascists. And it's a country that's always had a problem with that kind of Nazism/fascism. So we need to be concerned about that. It's not just a red herring that Putin's putting out there as a justification for war. They have a long, bloody history with Nazis, and as you said, with the invasion of Russia from Nazi Germany. So that's a real concern on their part, and it should be a real concern on our part. We're at any other country, and were we in the situation reversed, and another side, say Russia or somebody else, China, was dealing with a country with a Nazi problem, that would be the first thing we would point to. We'd say, well, they've got Nazis all through their country, therefore we're justified in going up and trying to confront them. So we turned a blind eye to the fact that there's in the Azov battalion in Ukraine, they're wearing the patches on their uniform that are clear Nazis emblems. In that part of Ukraine, they celebrate the birthday of the Nazi. Is it Stefan Bandera, I guess, the famed Nazi. So, it's a really awful history that Ukraine has to confront. I mean, it doesn't mean the whole country is bad or anything like that. We have our own fascist problem here in the United States that we're trying to confront. Ukraine needs to do the same.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, some of my liberal friends, the Blue Anon folks, they don't believe that. But you know who did believe it? Barack Obama, because he refused to send those missiles in there because he didn't want to put them in the hands of the Azov battalion that Brad's talking about,
Right.
those Nazis over there. And how did they get them? Well, Trump gave them to him after the political pressure and the, the move to impeach him and that type of thing. So they got them. They're in there. And, Putin's all too aware of that. Now, the other thing about it is when I read that article, and I'm not going to show a clipping from it, but again, I'm looking for negotiations. I want deliberations. I want talks. I want to get this process started. If Putin is saying, and he did, that the number one major problem are these Nazis in Ukraine, why doesn't the United States go running in there and say, hey, we're no fan of Nazis. We'll help you get rid of them. And we'll go in there. The UN will go in there with Russia with some kind of oversight, whatever you want. And we'll rid Ukraine of Nazis. We'll hunt them down with you. And once we do that, then you're out, Putin. I mean, because you said, and we've got the quote right here, that this was the number one major, biggest issue for you. Now, we'll sort all these other things out, too, these other grievances that you have, but we'll help you get rid of this number one issue. But I don't see anybody talking like that.
Not at all, and we should be. And when you look at what the criteria for membership in NATO consists of, it consists of having free and fair elections, not persecuting minorities, engaging in peaceful resolutions to conflicts. So Ukraine is not meeting most of those conditions for NATO membership. And I would argue that the United States doesn't even meet most of those criteria for membership in NATO. But yes, we should say, Ukraine, engage in a real sincere program where you're going to rid your military, at the very least, of Nazis who are openly wearing Nazi emblems. It's hard to remove Nazism from somebody's mind, but you can certainly remove it when people are projecting it on their uniforms. They're obviously supporting it. So get rid of it there. And you talked about the need for negotiations and deliberations. I find it fascinating that when the United States chief negotiator, the chief diplomat, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, says there's no room for negotiations in Ukraine. Now, so when there's no room for negotiations in Ukraine and our chief negotiator is saying that, we're really in a bad state.
Yeah, tell that to a couple of 100,000 boys on both sides that are in the ground because of it. The great Suzanne Murphy has joined us here. She makes this comment, and she's correct. Congress passed a bill, and I don't know if it actually became a bill, but maybe it did, to stop funding Nazis in Ukraine. It was then reversed. Yeah. And I mean, they'll tell you it was reversed for other reasons or whatever, but the fact of the matter is that happened, folks. Good point by Suzanne. Okay, let me bring this up on screen here. I want to move along here and see if I can get to some of these other things now. As we mentioned, supposedly Biden is isolated among NATO allies and his reluctance to do so. And Brad elaborated on that a little bit. That claim is contradicted by the story's own last paragraph, the one that Noam Chomsky once quipped should be read first, which acknowledges that others argue more quietly that NATO membership could give Mr. Putin more incentive to continue the war or to escalate it. We talked about that. Indeed, since Moscow has already declared NATO membership for Ukraine to be completely unacceptable and an existential threat, think about Cuba and all that, the prevention of which is one of its chief war aims. A Vilnius declaration that Ukraine will join NATO when the war ends will effectively ensure that the war goes on forever. It will also take off the table the West's central bargaining chip to achieve peace, which is a neutral Ukraine. Yeah. And okay, so we covered that pretty much. It's what Brad was talking about. But I wanted to get to this next item because it's kind of a further extension of this. And again, I looked at this and my God, really? I entitled this Crossing the War Rubicon. Now, influential foreign policy thinkers in the U.S. and Russia advocate nuclear escalations. And this gets overlooked, and I have mentioned it on my show before. I think, again, Matthew Ho is one of the people that pointed this out. Everybody thinks of Putin as the Antichrist, as the absolute worst thing that could ever happen, ever to come out of Russia. No, there's people worse than Putin over there. They're called advisors. There are people that want to maybe do a little nuclear war. Same way with Biden or Trump or any of those guys. My God, think about Pompeo or John Bolton or people like that on our side of the equation. There's bigger nuts over here also. This guy, Sergei Karaganov, I can't even pronounce his name, who has served as a presidential advisor in the Kremlin, both under Boris Yeltsin as well as Vladimir Putin, is making the case that Russia should lower the threshold for nuclear weapons use. His reasoning stems from the perspective that intellectual and moral degradation has Western elites dead set on escalation in its Ukraine proxy war, not just in an attempt to weaken Russia, but eyeing its destruction. Oh my God. Well, people have been saying this all along, and now it's coming out of this guy's mouth, who is maybe whispering in the ear of Vladimir Putin. That's really chilling, Brad.
It is indeed. And if you click on the link to his actual article, the long article I read, he has this argument, which is that since the end of the Cold War, the West has lost the fear of Armageddon. We've lost the fear of nuclear weapons. And that fear is, according to him, what kept the peace for 75 years. And so in order to get that fear back into the minds of the West, Russia needs to lower the nuclear threshold. And they would do that by putting the missiles in Belarus. He also recommends giving an order to Russians living in certain areas in Ukraine to leave, to get out, so that if nukes are fired, they would be spared. And also to have a different nuclear posture for Russia in firing nukes. So that fear will be instilled in us again, and then we will not continue to try to provoke Russia and dominate all of Europe and much of Russia. Part of his argument in doing this is he thinks Russia very much needs to look to the East to develop and use their resources and not continue to be tied up in the West. And he's emphasizing the Urals and much of Eurasia that needs attention from Russia. So it's a very rational argument, but it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying that the nuclear gun has to be placed to our heads in order for us just to be at peace with each other. And that's what he's arguing. And I have no doubt Putin has read the article, if not had a direct conversation with this gentleman.
Yeah, and the article even talks about crossing the Rubicon. That's maybe the most chilling part of this. What they're saying is it's already happened.
Yes.
We're already there. We just don't know it. And you say, oh, hell, that couldn't happen without us knowing it. Well, I lived through Vietnam, and I saw how that war started as an example. We didn't know any of that. We were in there. We were at war. It was planned. It was projected. Right. It happened, folks. I mean, yeah, we can be crossing a Rubicon and not even be aware of it. And that's what indeed has happened. And, you know, you think, well, there isn't anybody that would support or promote even a limited nuclear war or the use of tactical nuclear weapons on either side of this equation. The hell they wouldn't. I mean, these military guys were. I used to have a friend that was in the military, and he said they were taught, to overcome the effects of a nuclear strike was to simply turn the soil over. I mean, if you just took a shovel basically and turned the soil over, you'd be A-okay. That's how crazy the military can be about nuclear war. And that brings us to this next story. Because
nobody should doubt the fact that the United States military would launch nukes if the United States was really on its last legs, facing a major, major defeat the way Russia could face a major, major defeat in Ukraine. Nobody should doubt that the United States would use nukes in that instance.
Yeah. Okay. So let me get back here. I want to bring this. Let's see where. Okay. Let me click the right button. There we go. So this is something that you and I first talked about. Well, you talked about. It brought it to my attention. Actually, this is a very important story. Again, another one of these things that you don't hear or see reported. And it's fact. I mean, it was covered a little bit. You'd see it in some places, but people don't get the significance. This is an antiwar.com. Go and subscribe to that. Sign up. Follow that. Well, I don't want to support you don't want to support anti-war. I mean, what are you, a war fan? Some of the hell, go follow these folks, for God's sakes, people. The U.S. is set to provide Ukraine with depleted uranium rounds for Abrams tanks. The toxic ammunition is linked to cancer and birth defects. The Biden administration is expected to provide Ukraine with controversial depleted uranium ammunition to use with U.S. made Abrams tanks, the Wall Street Journal reported on Tuesday. So I saw that, and I immediately thought of you, Brad, but you put it in very understandable terms. Why would anybody use shells with depleted uranium on
Yeah.
a tank? How's that work?
Yeah, so depleted uranium is the byproduct when we make nuclear reactors, nuclear fuel. And it's a very dense material that in the 90s, the US military started testing down at Vieques in Puerto Rico on the beach down there that we just kind of took after World War II and used as a testing ground for various things. And so depleted uranium, when it's put in shells, and it's put in these A-10 Warthog planes that have a huge Gatling gun kind of weapon on it that fires these enormous shells that have depleted uranium on the tip. And they fire at such high speed and they're so dense they can pierce armor. So once they pierce the armor, they incinerate everything inside. But the uranium, once it hits, becomes aerosolized, which means it becomes airborne. So not only are you killing the people in the tank, your enemy, but all of that radiation becomes airborne and is airborne for tens of thousands of years. It's out there, it's blowing in the air, it's in the soil. So we use this in Yugoslavia, we use this in Desert Storm 1. We used it again in Desert Storm 2 or Iraq 2. And the number of birth defects in Iraq from this stuff being in the soil a generation after we used it is astronomical. These poor children in these hospitals in Iraq with these terrible deformities from depleted uranium shells. So this is a form of nuclear war that the United States and others think they can engage in without really calling it nuclear war. But it is radiation shells that are killing innocents long after the fact, long after the fact. The UK is sending those shells to Ukraine now, and it looks like we are getting ready to do so. So it's terrifying. And by the way, that beach down at Vieques in Puerto Rico is loaded with all this uranium.
My God. And I think about, I listen to you and I think, well, who the hell would do that?
Yeah.
Well, the merchants of death would do that, folks. That's what we're talking about here. Let me bring this up on screen. It makes for a very nice segue. There's the artwork of the Arstide, Carol Hartman. Just love her. I mean, that's her artwork. It's you can go see that on the Emergence of Death War Crimes Tribunal. I want to encourage everybody to go there. And this opening page starts right off with this quote from the great Cornel West, which really sums it up. We render you corporations obsessed with war profiteering accountable and answerable. So give us an update here. Tell us about and I've got the date on here when we were creeping ever closer to November.
We are.
With the War Crimes Tribunal. What's happening, Brad?
So we continue to interview retired military officers, analysts, victims, lawyers about this. And again, it's a people's tribunal where we are holding 4 U.S. weapons manufacturers accountable for crimes against humanity. And those 4 are Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and General Atomics. And they're representative of the whole U.S. war industry. And we're building a case and we're recording the videos, and we're going to be making videos that beginning the weekend of November 11th, 12th, which is Armistice Weekend 2023, we will begin showing these videos on consecutive Sundays, which lay out a case against the weapons manufacturers in the United States for war crimes. And then we have a tribunal, a panel of judges who will render a verdict, write an opinion, and possibly offer recommendations as to how to go forward. And this is a way to try to place in context everything that you and I talk about regularly, George, all this stuff that your show does so well. It's to try to put it in a narrative context so the American people and people across Europe can understand it. Some of these videos could be taken and taught in schools, in colleges and universities, because we are partnering with universities on this. We have college interns working for us doing the research on this. So it's a very progressive but also time-consuming effort, but we hope it's going to bear fruit. We hope it'll be a way to do some of the truth-telling that you're talking about and Ellsberg is talking about. Along that truth-telling, one thing I wanted to quick say, you had mentioned antiwar.com, go to that.
Yeah.
It's a great website, and it is. It's my go-to spot in the morning. And for a year, they've been talking about these issues in Ukraine that you and I have been talking about, that we've known. And finally, so this week, Harper's puts a cover story out.
I like that cover. Yeah.
Why are we in Ukraine? And finally says what people on antiwar.com have been writing about for the last year. And, Harper's is a big mainstream kind of, I mean, they're provocative and they're contrarian, but they're also have a big audience. And so a year later, they catch on and finally write what Antiwar has been writing about for the last year. And it's 300,000 lives later. And as journalists, they should have been on the ball a lot earlier and perhaps could have saved more lives. And that's what the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal was hoping to do, because it's all education. And if the government, through the Espionage Act or other attempts at censorship, is going to try to shut down that conversation of truth-telling, then we're going to have to resist. We're just going to have to look down the barrel the way Daniel Ellsberg did and others did. Last week, I was with, in Ithaca, New York, the Grady family, and their father, John Grady, was the leader of the Camden 28, who in 1973 staged a draft board action, went in, and they were destroying draft files. Nonviolent protests to destroy draft files. He was facing 45 years in prison when he went to trial for that action. 45, and he knew it, and he expected to go away. He had children, but this was something he had to do. Amazingly, he defended himself, and he was acquitted along with the others. The jury acquitted them. But that's the kind of bravery that it just may take in this country to get the word out about what we're doing before we blow ourselves up.
Yeah, and they've got to be forced. I talk about that all the time on the show. In Vietnam, Ellsberg, I mean, he could have just said, well, I work for the Rand Corporation, and I've seen the inner workings of this, and here's what I believe. You know what you wouldn't know his name today. Right. I mean, he forced their hand by releasing those materials. FDR himself said that, he wouldn't have done the New Deal if he hadn't been forced to. I mean, he was an oligarch, basically. I mean, that's who Roosevelt was, for God's sake. But, the socialists and the communists and the people that were, looking at their children starve in the Great Depression, they forced FDR to do that. He knew, I mean, he could either address it, he could either do what they were demanding, or they were going to take it. Right. And so that's how you have to handle these things. Assange is a good example. I mean, they bring him over here. People are going to have to get in the street. Chris Hedges, I mentioned, that's what he's talking about. I mean, he's talking about in Virginia, when they bring him over here, they're going to put him in front of a hanging judge, basically, that convicts 99.9% of the people brought in front of him. And if anybody's going to save Julian Assange, they've got to force the issue. It's not going to happen in the normal process of things with the status quo. Now, before I leave you today, Brad, I wanted to ask you something. I have a friend of mine that watches the show regularly, and he always asks this question about the War Crimes Tribunal. He says, well, does it have any legal standing, any weight of law? And he wants to hang these companies up by the highest lanyard, basically, legally. And I said, no, it's primarily an educational tool. It's primarily an informational, educational tool to make people aware so that they will do something about it. But is there something more to it that I'm missing, maybe?
It's also a political act of resistance, so it does not have legal authority, but it has moral authority, and it has the power of the citizenry behind it, which we feel is very important. So this is a citizens movement. And interestingly, there are attorneys in France who have filed an actual lawsuit against French weapons manufacturers for supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia, who are killing innocents in Yemen. That case is going forward. And one of my colleagues, Nick Modern, just returned from Berlin, where he met with those attorneys to talk about their case to help us as we present our case. So our hope is, while this tribunal that we're doing right now is not in an actual legal setting, part of the recommendations may be to lawyers in the United States or lawyers in other countries representing victims of U.S. war crimes would sue U.S. companies and do just as the French attorneys are doing, pull these countries into a real court and sue them and hold them accountable. So that's part of the effort as well.
All right, great. And we're coincidentally just about out of time here. We're coming up to the top of the hour again. I want to give you the last word, Brad. Now, I've got the URL up there for the Merchants of Death. And, I want people to go there, support it, join in the cause here, help with this, because this is serious. I mean, I don't know how else to tell people, but this is falling apart all around us very quickly now in rapid succession. The dominoes seem to be falling. The Rubicon has been crossed, as I mentioned. And this, we don't want to be sitting around with our faces hanging out here in just a matter of weeks, maybe.
Right.
And you can go to the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal.org, merchantsofdeath.org is the URL. I should say that because of audio only. Merchantsofdeath.org. Sign up, learn more, and become a part of this. But I'll give you a last word, Brad. Take it away.
Yeah, sure. This entire show that we've talked about has a common theme that runs through it. We started with Ellsberg and Assange, truth tellers, citizens, everyday citizens willing to take enormous risk to try to help their country and to save lives. And I think that's what all of us are going to have to do. Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal is a part of that, but everybody in every community can do something. This is not going to happen by other people, right? It's going to happen by us. And we have to be able to hold hope and despair in our mind at the same time, recognizing that standing in resistance to these overwhelming forces is what it means to be human. And if we shut ourselves off and turn a blind eye and say, it's too big, there's nothing we can do, we're denying our humanity. And so the more of us who stand together and create a movement like the civil rights movement to stop this kind of militarism, the better. That's the only way it's going to end. It's the only way we're going to save ourselves.
That's great. That's well stated. So go to the tribunal's website.
Yes.
Merchantsofdeath.org, right? Is that? Yeah,
correct.
I got that.
Merchantsofdeath.org. Yes.
Yeah, and learn, read about it, see what they're doing. If nothing else, volunteer if you can, or you can throw them a few bucks. I mean, I do that. It's no big deal. I mean, Brad mentioned how time-consuming, difficult, and expensive for people to bear this burden by themselves. So become a part of this. It'd be a great thing to do. And man, we need it now more than ever. And who could tell you that? Ellsberg could have told you that. And Assange will tell you that if he ever gets the hood off of his head when he comes over to the United States. So that's where we're at right now. Brad, thanks again for coming on the podcast by George Liveline.
Thank you so much, George. Appreciate all you do.
Yeah, we'll talk again soon, folks. And of course, that was Brad Wolf. He's the executive director and founder of the Peace Action Network, Lancaster, PA, a former prosecutor, lawyer, and community college dean, and he heads the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. And folks, I hope you enjoyed the show. Yeah, I want to thank all of the people that left some great comments, particularly the great Suzanne Murphy, but also Vern Deegs weighed in there. And Joe Gordon was on the show with some comments earlier on. Now, he's the Brady United guy. I mean, this guy, he's all over these major issues of the day, particularly gun violence. Joe Gordon left us a comment or two also. So thanks for that. Thanks for watching. And if you want to subscribe now, if you're seeing this on replay in particular and you think I like this, well, the easy way to do it is go to podcastbygeorge.com. I tell people to do this all the time. Don't search us on Facebook and YouTube, because that's really not easy. The terms podcast and George are so generic, you may not find it with your search. But if you go to podcastbygeorge.com, you can click on an icon, a badge, a button there that will take you right to the Facebook home, right to the YouTube home. You can subscribe very easily, follow us on those platforms. That's where the video live streams are seen. And then just to get the audio, to re-listen to this in audio format when you're riding about on your bike or in your car or whatever, click on iTunes, the iHeart radio app. Spotify is a big one for us, Stitcher, Deezer, all of those kinds of places where podcasts are heard. But that is going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.